Amina was the kind of woman people noticed even without her trying. Educated, sharp, and hardworking, she carried herself with quiet dignity. In Lagos, where life moved fast and expectations from women were often tied only to the home, Amina stood out. She had dreams tucked deep inside her, but most people only saw her as Kunle's wife. Kunle, her husband, was a wealthy businessman with a loud laugh and a sharper tongue. In public, he made sure everyone knew he was in charge. He loved the spotlight, but in keeping that light on himself, he often dimmed Amina's. One evening, they were invited to a grand dinner at a friend's house. The room glittered with expensive chandeliers, men in tailored suits, and women in elegant gowns. Amina sat quietly at the long table, her smile soft but steady, while Kunle dominated the conversation. With every glass of wine, his arrogance grew bolder. His friends laughed at his jokes, even when the jokes were cruel. And then, as always, he turned to Amina. "Look at her," Kunle said, smirking. "Pretty to look at but completely useless. She can't even earn 1 naira on her own." His friends chuckled, some uncomfortably, others too eager to stay on his good side. Amina's face burned, but she did not let her eyes drop. She had heard this before, again and again, yet every time it cut a little deeper. She pressed her fingers together under the table, willing herself not to break. What nobody in that glittering room knew was that Amina's silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone storing pain, turning it into strength, waiting for her moment. Amina's life on the surface looked ordinary. She was the wife who kept the home in order, the woman who smiled politely at family gathering, the one society thought they had already defined. But inside her, a fire burned quietly. Since she was a girl, she had loved colors, fabrics, and the way style could tell a story. Over the years, she also grew fascinated with technology, the way apps and digital tools were reshaping the world. In her heart, she dreamed of building something new, something bold, a fashion and tech fusion startup that could connect African creativity with global innovation. But this was not a dream she could speak out loud. The moment a woman in her community mentioned ambition beyond the home, people's faces tightened. A woman's place is in the kitchen, her relatives would remind her, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a sharp warning. Even Kunle, her own husband, believed that her value was only in how well she cooked or how gracefully she hosted his friends. If she ever hinted at wanting more, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand, as though her words had no weight. So Amina kept her dream hidden. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Kunle had fallen asleep, she would pull out a small notebook from under the bed. By the light of a dim lamp, she filled its pages with sketches of dresses that combined traditional African patterns with modern digital elements. She drew diagrams of apps that could help young designers sell their work, notes about fabrics, lists of ideas for investors she had never met. Each page was her secret world, a place where no one could call her useless. Sometimes, after a long day of insults and indifference, Amina would open those notebooks and run her hand gently across the pages. They gave her comfort, like talking to a friend who truly understood her. She imagined what it would feel like to see her designs walking down a runway, or to watch a young woman in another country buy clothes through an app she had created. For a few moments, she allowed herself to feel powerful, even if in silence. Her heart often ached at the gap between who she was forced to be and who she wanted to become. Yet she never let go of the vision. Every word of dismissal from society only pushed her further into determination. They said the kitchen was her place, but she believed the world could also be her place. They told her to stay small, but she carried within her the sketches of something vast, something that could grow bigger than even her own imagination. And though no one knew it yet, those secret notebooks were the foundation of a future that would shake every insult, every stereotype, and every limitation that had ever been placed on her. Kunle was the kind of man who lived for applause. He loved to sit among his wealthy friends, swirling a glass of wine in his hand, talking loudly enough so the whole room heard him. For him, success wasn't just about money. It was about showing others he had more of it. And when the conversation turned to family, he found his favorite way to make himself shine, by dimming Amina. "My wife," he would laugh, leaning back in his chair. "She can't even make a single naira on her own. Imagine that. Other men's wives are running boutiques, restaurants, even real estate businesses, and mine? She just sits at home." The table would erupt with forced laughter, some of his friends joining in, others exchanging awkward glances. But Kunle never noticed. He was too busy enjoying the sound of his own pride. The comparisons never stopped. At every gathering, he found a way to mention how one of his friends' wives had launched a company, or how another was helping her husband expand his business. Then he would glance at Amina, shake his head, and add, "But look at mine, she's just a decoration." He thought these words made him look stronger, but each one fell on Amina like a stone. Inside, Amina broke a little each time. She wanted to scream, to tell him about the notebooks filled with her designs, about the nights she stayed awake imagining her startup, about the ideas that kept her alive when the world tried to bury her spirit. But she kept quiet. Her silence wasn't because she agreed. It was because she knew if she spoke too soon, he would crush her dream before it had even taken its first breath. So instead, she turned that pain into fuel. Every insult became another reason to work harder. When Kunle compared her to other women, she reminded herself that her vision was bigger than any boutique or side hustle. Her dream was to build something that could reach across borders, something that could inspire women everywhere. And though he mocked her, she believed one day he would see her not as useless, but as unstoppable. At night, when Kunle slept peacefully, unaware of the wounds his words had left, Amina sat at her small desk with her notebooks. She researched fabrics, learned about business models, and studied the basics of technology through borrowed books and her old laptop. Each line she wrote, each sketch she drew, was a silent rebellion against his arrogance. Kunle thought he was proving his power by boasting in front of his friends. But what he didn't know was that every time he laughed at her, he was helping build a fire inside her. Amina was no longer just dreaming, she was preparing. And though her heart often ached with the weight of his words, deep down she knew. The same man who called her useless would one day be forced to introduce her with pride. The turning point in Amina's life came on a night she hadn't even planned for herself. Kunle had been invited to a big networking event in Lagos, an evening filled with top businessmen, investors, and politicians. As usual, he wanted Amina by his side, not because he valued her presence, but because he thought a wife made him look more respectable in front of powerful people. Amina dressed in a simple but elegant gown she had sewn herself, a piece she was proud of though no one ever asked where it came from. At the event, the air buzzed with energy. Deals were being made in corners, glasses clinked, and conversations about money floated across the room. Kunle, as expected, moved quickly toward his circle of friends, leaving Amina to stand near the buffet table. She didn't mind. Being invisible had become her survival skill. But fate had other plans. As she adjusted her clutch bag, she bumped into a tall, kind-eyed man. He introduced himself as Dr. Chaik, a South African entrepreneur known for investing in new ideas across the continent. Unlike most men she had met in such gatherings, he didn't brush her aside when she spoke. Instead, he asked her about herself. At first, Amina hesitated, almost repeating the line she had practiced her whole life. "Oh, I'm just a housewife." But something about his warmth gave her courage. For the first time, she shared a glimpse of her dream. She spoke about her vision of blending African fashion with technology, how young designers could showcase their work through digital platforms, how traditional fabrics could meet modern trends, and how this could place African creativity on the global stage. Her words flowed out as if they had been waiting years to be heard. Dr. Chaik listened intently, nodding with genuine interest. "That's brilliant," he said, his voice steady but excited. "You speak with so much clarity. Do you know how powerful this idea could be?" Amina's heart raced. She wasn't used to anyone, especially a man of his stature, treating her words as valuable. By the end of the night, they had exchanged contacts. From then on, a secret chapter of her life began. While Kunle thought she was busy with household chores or visiting relatives, Amina was meeting with Dr. Chaik in quiet cafes and over late-night calls. He became her mentor, guiding her on how to shape her ideas into a business model, how to approach potential investors, and how to believe in herself even when the world doubted her. Those secret meetings became her lifeline. For the first time, she had someone who didn't laugh at her ambition, someone who reminded her that her dream wasn't foolish. Each session lit a spark in her, and slowly, she started to see herself not just as Kunle's wife, but as a future CEO. Kunle had no idea. He thought she was still the silent woman he could dismiss. But Amina had stepped onto a new path, one that was quietly rewriting her destiny. Amina's double life had begun. By day, she played the role everyone expected of her. Quiet wife, polite daughter-in-law, the woman in the background of Kunle's loud world. But by night, when the house fell into silence and Kunle's snores echoed from the bedroom, she came alive. Her small desk became her battlefield, her notebook her weapon, and her laptop the bridge to a future no one could see but her. She spent countless hours sketching designs, researching fabrics, learning about e-commerce platforms, and teaching herself the basics of coding. The nights were long, the coffee strong, and the fatigue heavy, but she refused to stop. The road was far from easy. Her first attempt at getting samples made ended in heartbreak. A supplier took her money and vanished without delivering anything. She felt crushed, staring at the empty space where her dreams should have been. Friends she trusted to help her laughed behind her back, calling her ideas childish. Even some relatives, when they found out she was wasting time on business plans, shook their heads and said, "Why bother? Your husband is already rich." Those words stung, but they also reminded her why she had to keep going. Every failure was a lesson. Amina learned to be smarter with her choices, tougher with her negotiations, and sharper with her instinct. When one door slammed shut, she found another to knock on. When people doubted her, she quietly added their names to the long list of voices she would one day prove wrong. There were nights when exhaustion nearly broke her. She would sit at her desk, her eyes heavy, her hands trembling from too much work and too little sleep. Tears often blurred her sketches, but instead of closing the notebook, she would wipe her face and keep writing. She knew what was at stake. This was not just about fashion or technology. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her identity, and her voice in a world that kept trying to silence her. Slowly, small wins started to appear. A local tailor agreed to take her sketches seriously and produced a few pieces that matched her vision. A young tech student she met online helped her design a basic app layout in exchange for free meals. Bit by bit, Amina was building the skeleton of her startup. No one around her could see it yet, but deep inside she knew she was laying bricks for something powerful. Her growth was secret, her victories quiet, but her spirit was louder than ever. Every sleepless night brought her closer to the woman she was meant to be. She wasn't just surviving Kunle's insults anymore. She was preparing for the day when the whole world would see the strength he had tried so hard to bury. And though she was still walking in shadows, Amina knew the light was waiting for her. Kunle loved hosting grand dinners. For him, they were not just gatherings, they were performances. His home would shine with the best decor, the tables lined with expensive wine and food meant to impress. On this particular night, he invited some of the most influential men in Lagos, business leaders, investors, politicians. Amina moved quietly through the house, making sure everything was perfect. She greeted guests with a warm smile, her calm presence balancing Kunle's loud energy. The evening began with laughter and clinking glasses. Kunle sat at the center of the table, entertaining his friends with exaggerated stories of his business deal. Amina sat beside him, listening silently. She had grown used to being invisible in these gatherings, but tonight felt different. There was something in her chest, calm yet powerful, like she was holding a secret the world was about to know. As the night went on, the conversation turned toward family and success. One of Kunle's friends proudly spoke about his wife's new company. Another mentioned how his wife was managing investments alongside him. Kunle smirked, leaned back in his chair, and with that familiar sharp tone said, "My wife? She's just a liability. She doesn't earn a kobo. Pretty face, yes, but beyond that, nothing." The table went quiet for a moment before nervous laughter broke out. Some of the men chuckled, but their eyes flickered toward Amina. Something about the way she sat, straight-backed, composed, her eyes steady, didn't match the insult. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her head like she used to. Instead, she held her chin high, her face glowing with a quiet confidence. It unsettled them. One of the guests, noticing the contrast, tried to change the subject, but Kunle continued. He compared her again to the wives of his friends, saying how others brought value to their homes while his wife was simply a shadow. Amina didn't respond. She simply pressed her hands together on the table, her smile soft, her gaze fixed. The calmness on her face was so strong that it made his words sound smaller. The guests exchanged glances. They could sense something Kunle couldn't. It was in her eyes, an unspoken strength, a quiet defiance. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to defend herself. Her silence wasn't the silence of shame anymore. It was the silence of someone who was waiting for the right moment to change the story. Kunle laughed loudly, thinking he had won the room. But the truth was people weren't laughing with him anymore. They were looking at Amina, curious, almost expectant, as if they could feel the storm quietly building behind her calm expression. For the first time, Kunle's arrogance didn't shine as bright. And though she said nothing that night, Amina's presence spoke louder than any insult he could throw. Something was shifting, and everyone at that table could feel it, even if Kunle was still too blind to see. The dinner was at its peak. The table was full of noise, glasses clinking, laughter bouncing across the room, and Kunle's booming voice louder than anyone else's. He was in his element, telling stories, exaggerating his victories, and throwing in his usual jabs at Amina. She sat quietly, calm as ever, her hands folded on her lap. But inside her, she carried a secret big enough to shake the entire room. Then, in the middle of the chatter, Amina's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a call she had been waiting for, but she hadn't expected it to come right now, in front of everyone. With steady hands, she excused herself softly and stepped away from the table. The men barely noticed. Kunle had their full attention. But a few of them saw the spark in her eyes as she answered. On the other end was Dr. Chaik. His voice carried excitement. "Amina, it's done. The $10 million investment deal has been signed. Congratulations, CEO." For a moment, she couldn't speak. She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. All the sleepless nights, the failures, the tears, they had led to this. She whispered a thank you, her voice trembling but firm, then walked back into the dining room, her face glowing with a confidence no one had ever seen before. Just then, the front door opened, and to everyone's surprise, in walked Dr. Chaik himself. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned. He smiled warmly and greeted the men, who quickly stood up to shake his hand. But then he looked at Amina, walked over, and said with clear pride, "Congratulations, CEO Amina. Tonight, we celebrate your company's $10 million deal." The room froze. For a moment, silence hung heavy, and then gasps filled the air. Kunle's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The same woman he had called useless, in front of these very friends, was now being introduced as the CEO of a company worth millions. Some of the guests looked at Kunle with raised brows, others struggled to hide their smirks. A few even let out small laughs, shaking their heads at the irony. The man who had spent years mocking his wife now sat in shame, exposed in front of his peers. Meanwhile, Amina stood tall, her hands steady, her smile calm. She didn't gloat, didn't throw back an insult. She didn't need to. Her success spoke louder than anything she could have said. Kunle tried to force a laugh, mumbling, This must be some mistake." But no one paid him attention anymore. The spotlight had shifted. It was on Amina, the woman he had dismissed, the woman who had risen in silence. For the first time, the room didn't see her as just Kunle's wife. They saw her for who she truly was, CEO Amina. And in that moment, it was clear. Everything had changed forever. Kunle sat frozen in his chair, unable to hide the shock on his face. Just a few minutes ago, he had been laughing the loudest, throwing insults at Amina as if she were nothing. Now the same friends who used to laugh along with him were staring at him different. Some whispered to each other, some smirked openly, and a few looked at him with pity. His chest tightened as the words CEO Amina kept echoing in the room. For years, he had built his pride on the belief that he was the powerful one, the provider, the man whose wife was only an accessory. But now, in front of everyone he had tried so hard to impress, his pride cracked. The truth stood clear. The woman he mocked was not only capable, but far more successful than he could have ever imagined. He forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "Well, this is unexpected," he said weakly, looking around for support. But his friends didn't join him this time. Some avoided his eyes, while others chuckled quietly at his discomfort. The very audience he wanted to impress was now laughing at him. His arrogance, once his strongest armor, had become his humiliation. Amina, on the other hand, stood calm and graceful. She didn't need to raise her voice or throw back the insults he had hurled at her for years. She simply lifted her chin and smiled politely, thanking Dr. Chaik and shaking hands with the guests who came forward to congratulate her. Her quiet strength filled the room in a way that silenced even the loudest laugh. Kunle looked at her and saw something he had never bothered to notice before: the steadiness in her eyes, the confidence in her posture, the dignity she carried without needing his approval. The same woman he had called useless was now standing in the center of the room, respected, admired, and celebrated. He, the man who once prided himself on control, suddenly felt small. As the night went on, more people gathered around Amina, asking about her startup, her vision, her journey. Kunle sat in the background, invisible for the first time in his own house. Every word of praise for Amina was like a mirror forcing him to see his own mistakes. The arrogance that had defined him for years crumbled quietly in that moment. Amina never looked at him with revenge or spite. She didn't need to. Her success was enough. She stood with dignity, answering questions with clarity, her calm smile showing that she had never needed his validation. The more she shined, the more his shame deepened. By the end of the night, it was clear to everyone, the powerful one in that room was not Kunle. It was Amina. And nothing could be more humiliating for a man who had built his pride on tearing her down than to realize she had risen higher than he had ever dreamed. The room was still buzzing with excitement when someone asked Amina to say a few words. For a moment, she hesitated. She had spent years being silenced, years swallowing her thoughts while Kunle spoke for her. Now all eyes were on her, not as someone's wife, not as a shadow, but as a leader in her own right. She took a deep breath, stood tall, and began to speak. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that pulled everyone in. "For years, I was told I was useless," she said softly, her eyes scanning the room. "I was told that a woman's place is only in the kitchen, that she has no right to dream, no right to create. And maybe some of you here have thought the same about the women in your life." The hall grew silent. Glasses were set down, and even the softest whispers stopped. Amina continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But tonight, I want to say one thing clearly. Never call a woman useless. A woman can build nations. A woman can carry generations. And a woman, when given the chance, can change the world." Her words struck deep. Several guests blinked back tears. Some nodded quietly, feeling the truth of her statement in their own hearts. The women in the room sat taller, their faces glowing with pride. Even the men, who had laughed at Kunle's jokes earlier, now looked down, ashamed of the times they had joined in that same cruel laughter. Amina paused, her gaze landing briefly on Kunle. She didn't glare or scold. She simply looked at him, then turned back to the crowd. To every woman sitting quietly in the shadows, your silence is not weakness. Your dreams matter. And one day, the world will hear your voice, just as it hears mine tonight. The applause that followed was thunderous. People stood on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping their eyes. It wasn't just a speech. It was a release of something everyone had been waiting to hear. A truth spoken with so much dignity that it pierced the heart. Kunle sat at the table, his head lowered, unable to meet anyone's eye. The man who once shouted the loudest now had no words. His pride had been broken in front of everyone, not by insults, not by revenge, but by the quiet strength of the very woman he had mocked. His silence was his only response, and in that silence he carried his shame. Amina, meanwhile, stood tall, her presence commanding the room. She hadn't just defended herself. She had spoken for countless women who had been silenced like her. In that moment, she wasn't just a wife or even just a CEO. She was a voice of resilience, a symbol of what dignity and determination could create. And everyone there knew they would never forget her words. The story of that unforgettable night did not stay in the dining room. By the next morning, videos and whispers had already found their way to social media. Guests who had witnessed the scene shared clips of Dr. Chaik calling her CEO Amina, and soon the internet was buzzing. Headlines read, "From useless to unstoppable, the rise of Amina." Her story spread like wildfire across Nigeria and beyond, inspiring women who had been told they were nothing to believe in their own power. People tweeted her quotes, especially the line from her speech, "Never call a woman useless, she can build nations." It became more than just a sentence. It became a movement. Young girls wrote it in their notebooks, women shared it with pride, and even men repeated it with respect. What had once been an insult was now transformed into an anthem of empowerment. With the momentum of her success, Amina decided her journey wasn't just for her. She started an NGO focused on training women in entrepreneurship, teaching them how to build businesses, manage finances, and chase their dreams with courage. She wanted every woman, no matter her background, to feel the same strength she had discovered in herself. The classrooms of her NGO were soon filled with hopeful faces, women carrying notebooks just like the ones she once hid under her bed. In the end, society learned a lesson that echoed far beyond Lagos. A woman's worth was never defined by her husband's words, nor by the limits placed on her by tradition. Her value lived in her spirit, her resilience, and her ability to rise. Amina had proven that, and now she was making sure countless other women could prove it too.